Chapter 3. The Mystery of Lauriston Gardens. I must confess that such a startling confirmation of my friend's theories left me deeply shaken. My respect for his analytical powers, already high, now rose to a new level. Yet a nagging doubt remained. Could this business with the messenger have been a clever ruse, prearranged to dazzle and deceive me? The thought involuntarily crossed my mind, and I wondered what possible motive he could have for playing such a trick. I turned to look at Sherlock Holmes. He had just finished reading the letter, and his face had taken on that vacant, brooding expression which showed that his thoughts were far away. "How on earth did you deduce that so accurately?" I asked. "Deduce what?" he asked, snapping back to the present. "Why, that the man was a retired sergeant of Marines." "I have no time for trifles," he exclaimed with a flash of irritation. Then, softening with a smile, he continued, "Forgive my brusqueness, but could you really not see for yourself that the man was an old sailor and a non-commissioned officer?" "Certainly not." "And yet," Holmes remarked, "it is far easier to know it than to explain how I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 make 4, you might find some difficulty, yet you are quite sure of the fact. Now, let us look at our subject. Even while he was across the street, I noticed a large blue anchor tattooed on the back of his hand. That smacked of the sea. Furthermore, he had a military carriage and kept his side whiskers trimmed in the regulation fashion. Finally, there was an air of authority about him, the habit of command. You must have noticed how he carried his head and swung his cane? Given that he was a man of a certain age and possessed a respectable air, I concluded he must have been a sergeant. Brilliant. I cried. Commonplace. Holmes replied, though I could see by his expression that he was quietly pleased by my enthusiasm. "Only a moment ago, I told you there were no longer any criminals," he continued. "It seems I was mistaken. Read this." He handed me the letter brought by the messenger. "But this is ghastly," I exclaimed, after scanning the contents. "Yes, it does seem to depart from the usual pattern," he remarked calmly. "Would you be so kind as to read it aloud to me?" The letter ran as follows. "Dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a most unfortunate affair occurred last night at No. 3, Lauriston Gardens, off the Brixton Road. At about 2 in the morning, a patrolling officer noticed a light in the window. As the house has been standing empty for some time, this struck him as suspicious, and he went to investigate. He found the door standing wide open. In the front room, which was entirely unfurnished, lay the body of a man, well-dressed and evidently of some social standing. In his pockets were cards bearing the name Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There was no evidence of robbery, nor is there any apparent cause of death. There are significant bloodstains throughout the room, yet there is not a single scratch upon the deceased. How the man entered an empty house remains a mystery. Indeed, the entire case is a profound enigma. If you can make it to the house before noon, I shall be there. I have left everything exactly as I found it until I can hear your views on the matter. If you cannot come, I will provide a more detailed report and should be honored to have your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson. Gregson is the smartest of the Scotland Yarders, my friend remarked. He and Lestrade are the best of a lackluster lot. Both are quick and energetic, but they are hopelessly conventional. Worse still, they are at daggers drawn with one another. They are as jealous of each other as two professional beauties. If they are both on this case, we may expect some entertainment. I was struck by the sheer nonchalance with which he spoke. "But you mustn't waste another second," I exclaimed. "Shall I run and fetch a hansom?" "I haven't quite decided whether I shall go at all. I am the most incurably idle devil that ever stood in shoe leather. That is, when the fit is on me, for I can be spry enough at times. But this is the very opportunity you've been longing for. My dear fellow, what does it matter to me? Supposing I unravel the whole tangle, you may rest assured that Gregson, Lestrade, and company will pocket all the credit. That is the inevitable result of being an unofficial personage. But he is begging for your help. Yes, he knows that I am his master, and he admits it to me, but he would rather cut his tongue out than admit it to any third person. However, we may as well go and have a look. I shall work it out on my own terms. If nothing else, I can at least have a laugh at them. Come, get your coat." He was as active and energetic now as he had been idle a moment before. "Get your hat," he said. "You wish me to come with you?" "Yes, if you have nothing better to do." A minute later we were both in a hansom, driving furiously toward the Brixton Road. It was a foggy, dismal morning, and a dun-colored veil hung over the housetops, looking like a reflection of the mud-stained streets below. Holmes was in the best of spirits and chatted away about Stradivarius violins and the merits of an Amati, while I was silent and dejected. The gloomy weather, combined with the gruesome business upon which we were engaged, had a depressing effect upon my nerves. "You don't seem to be giving much thought to the matter at hand," I remarked at last, interrupting my companion's musical disquisition. "No data yet," he answered. "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment." "You will not have long to wait," I said, pointing out the window. "That is the Brixton Road, and if I am not mistaken, there is the house. So it is— Stop, driver, stop." We were still 100 yards or so from the address, but Holmes insisted upon alighting, and we finished our journey on foot. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens, wore an ill-omened and minatory aspect. It was one of 4 houses which stood back some little way from the road, 2 being inhabited and 2 empty. The latter looked out with 3 tiers of vacant, melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, save here and there where to-let card had developed a cataract upon the bleared panes. A small garden, sprinkled with a few sickly plants, separated each house from the road, and was traversed by a narrow pathway, yellowish in color, and consisting apparently of a mixture of clay and gravel. The whole was soaked with the night's rain, and was a mere slush of mud. The gardens were bounded by a 3-foot wooden railing with a low brick foundation. As we approached, a police constable was leaning against the railings, surrounded by a small knot of idlers who craned their necks in a vain attempt to catch a glimpse of the drama within. I had expected Sherlock Holmes to rush immediately into the house and plunge into the study of the mystery. He did nothing of the sort, with an air of nonchalance which, under the circumstances, seemed to me to border on affectation. He sauntered up and down the pavement. He moved with short steps, his eyes wandering vacantly from the ground to the sky, from the opposite houses to the railings of number 3. Having finished the scrutiny, he proceeded slowly up the path, or rather upon the fringe of grass which bordered the path, keeping his eyes riveted upon the ground. Twice he stopped, and once I saw him smile and heard him utter a low cry of satisfaction. There were many footprints upon the wet, clayey soil, but since the police had been coming and going, I could not see how my companion could hope to learn anything from them. Still, I had had such proofs of his extraordinary powers that I was convinced he could see a great deal which was hidden from me. At the door of the house, we were met by a tall, pale-faced, flaxen-haired man, who rushed forward to wring my companion's hand. He held a large notebook in his hand. "It is indeed kind of you to come," he said. "I have left everything exactly as I found it." "Except for this," Holmes remarked, pointing to the pathway. "If a herd of buffalo had passed along here, there could not be a greater mess. No doubt, however, you had drawn your own conclusions, Gregson, before you permitted this." "I have had so much to do inside the house," the detective said evasively. "My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had relied upon him to look after the outside." Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows sardonically. "With 2 such men as yourself and Lestrade upon the ground, there will not be much for a third party to find," he said blandly. Gregson rubbed his hands in a self-satisfied way. "I think we have done all that can be done," he answered. "It's a queer case, though, and I knew your taste for such things." "You did not come here in a cab?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "No, sir." "Nor Lestrade?" "No, sir." "Then let us go and look at the room." With this irrelevant remark, as it seemed to me, he strode into the house, followed by Gregson, whose features touched an expression of utter bewilderment. A short passage, bare and dusty, led into the kitchen and offices. 2 doors opened off it, left and right. One had evidently been closed for many weeks. The other led into the dining room, which was the scene of the mysterious affair. Holmes walked in, and I followed him with that subdued feeling at my heart which the presence of death inspires. It was a large, square room, looking all the larger for being destitute of all furniture. The walls were covered with vulgar flock paper, blotched here and there with mildew, and hanging in loose strips where it had detached itself from the plaster. Opposite the door was a flamboyant mantelpiece of imitation white marble, with a red wax candle end stuck in a corner of the shelf. The windows were so dirty that the light was hazy and uncertain, giving a dull gray tone to everything, which was intensified by the thick layer of dust that coated the whole apartment. All these details I observed later. At the moment, my entire attention was centered upon the single, grim, motionless figure which lay stretched upon the boards, with vacant, sightless eyes staring up at the ceiling. He was a man of about 40, middle-sized and broad-shouldered. His hair was black and curly, and he wore a short, bristly beard. He was dressed in a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, with light-colored trousers, an immaculate collar and cuffs. A top hat, well brushed and brand new, lay on the floor beside him. His hands were clenched and his arms thrown abroad, while his lower limbs were interlocked as though his death struggle had been a grievous one. On his rigid face there stood an expression of horror, and, as it seemed to me, of hatred, such as I have never seen upon human features. This malignant contortion, combined with a low forehead, blunt nose, and prognathous jaw, gave the dead man a singularly ape-like and revolting appearance. I had seen death in many guises and forms, but never in more hideous aspect than in this dark room, just a stone's throw from one of the main arteries of suburban London. Lestrade, who had been standing by the doorway, greeted us with his characteristic dog-like air. "This case will make a stir, sir," he remarked. "I am no novice at my trade, and I have seen much, but this outdoes anything I have yet come across." "No clues at all?" asked Gregson. "None whatever," Lestrade chimed in. Sherlock Holmes approached the body and, kneeling beside it, began to examine it with the most intense concentration. "You are certain there is no wound upon the body?" he asked, pointing to the numerous splashes and gouts of blood which lay all around the corpse. "Positive," cried both detectives in unison. "Then this blood belongs to a second person, presumably the murderer, if murder has been committed. It reminds me forcibly of the circumstances attending the death of Van Jansen in Utrecht in the year 34. Do you remember the case, Gregson?" "No, sir." "Read it up. You really should. There is nothing new under the sun. Everything has been done before." As he spoke, his nimble fingers were flying here, there, and everywhere, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, examining every detail. Yet his face wore that same expression of vacancy and abstraction I had noticed before. The examination was so brief that it was hard to believe it could be thorough. Finally, he leaned down to the dead man's lips and sniffed. Then he subjected the soles of the man's shoes, which were of excellent quality, to a minute inspection. "Has the body been moved at all?" he asked. "No more than was necessary for our own examination." "You may take him to mortuary now," Holmes said. "He has nothing more to tell us." Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men in waiting. At his call, they entered the room and lifted the deceased. As they were placing him upon the stretcher, a ring dropped and rolled across the floor. Gregson clutched it and held it up with an expression of sheer amazement. "There has been a woman here," he cried. "It's a woman's wedding ring." We all crowded around him to inspect the find. There could be no doubt. It had once graced the finger of a bride. "This complicates matters significantly," Gregson muttered. "And heaven knows they were tangled enough already. Are you sure it doesn't simplify them?" Holmes remarked. "But we shall learn nothing from staring at the trinket. What did you find in the pockets?" "We have it all here," Gregson replied, pointing to a small heap of objects on one of the stairs. "A gold watch, number 97163, by Barraud of London, a heavy gold Albert chain, a gold ring with Masonic device, a gold pin, a bulldog's head with rubies for eyes, a Russian leather card case with cards of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland. The linen is marked with the same initials. E.G.D. There was no purse, but 75 shillings in loose silver. There is a pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron with the name of Joseph Stangerson on the flyleaf. Also, 2 letters, one addressed to EJD and one to Joseph Stangerson. At what address? American Exchange, Strand, to be left till call 4. Both are from the Guion Steamship Company and refer to the sailing of their boats from Liverpool. It is clear that this unfortunate man was about to return to New York. Have you made any inquiries about the Stangerson? I did so at once, said Gregson. I have had advertisements sent to all the papers, and I have sent one of my men to the American Exchange. But he has not yet returned. Did you telegraph to Cleveland? First thing this morning. How did you word your inquiry? I simply detailed the circumstances and stated that we should be glad of any information which could help us in our investigation. Did you not ask for particulars on any specific point which struck you as crucial? I focused my inquiries on Stangerson. Nothing else? Is there no single circumstance upon which the whole case appears to hinge? Will you not telegraph again? I have said all that is necessary, Gregson replied in a huffed tone. Sherlock Holmes muttered something under his breath and seemed on the verge of a sharp retort, when Lestrade, who had been in the front room while we were conversing in the hall, suddenly appeared before us, rubbing his hands with an air of immense self-satisfaction. Mr. Gregson, he said, I have just made a discovery of the highest importance. It is a detail which might easily have been overlooked had I not made a careful examination of the walls. The little detective's eyes sparkled. He could clearly not disguise his delight at having stolen a march on his colleague. Come this way, he said briskly, stepping back into the large room. We followed him, and the chamber seemed less oppressive now that the ghastly, contorted figure of the deceased had been removed. Now look at this. Lestrade cried triumphantly. He struck a match on his boot and held it up against the wall. Look there. As I mentioned, the paper had peeled away in several places. In this particular corner, a large piece had come off entirely, leaving a square of yellow plaster. Across this bare space, a single word had been scrawled in blood-red Gothic lettering. Rake. Well, gentlemen, said Lestrade, with the air of a showman, what do you make of that? It was overlooked because it was in this dark corner, where no one thought to look. The murderer, whether man or woman, wrote it with their own blood. See the smear where it trickled down the wall? That settles the question of suicide, at any rate. And why was this corner chosen? I'll tell you. Look at that candle on the mantelpiece. It was lit at the time, and if it was, this corner would be the most brightly illuminated part of the wall, though it is in shadow now. And now that you have made this discovery, Gregson asked in a voice full of irony, what does it signify? What does it signify? Why? It means that the writer was going to put the name Rachel, but was interrupted before he or she could finish. You mark my words, when this case is solved, you'll find a woman named Rachel is at the heart of it. It's all very well to laugh, Mr. Holmes. You may be very smart and clever, but the old hound is the best after all. I really must beg your pardon, said my companion, who had incensed the little detective by breaking into a fit of laughter. You certainly have the credit of being the first to find this, and it is, as you say, written by the second actor in last night's drama. I have not yet had a chance to examine the room, but with your permission, I shall do so now. As he spoke, Sherlock Holmes whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. With these 2 implements, he trotted noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once even lying flat upon his face. So engrossed was he in his task that he appeared to have forgotten our very existence. He kept up a continuous low murmuring to himself, punctuated by a series of groans, whistles, and little cries of encouragement and hope. As I watched him, he reminded me of nothing so much as a well-trained foxhound as it dashes backward and forward to the covert, whimpering in its eagerness, until it finally hits upon the lost scent. Holmes's maneuvers continued for about half an hour. We watched as he measured, with extraordinary precision, the distances between various marks on the floor that were entirely invisible to us. He applied the same meticulous process to the walls. To me, these measurements were utterly incomprehensible. He then carefully gathered a small amount of grayish dust from the floor and placed it in an envelope. Finally, he used his magnifying glass to scrutinize the inscription on the wall, tracing the contours of each letter with painstaking care. His task apparently finished, he returned the tape measure and the glass to his pocket. It is a common saying that genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains, Holmes remarked with a smile. It is a very bad definition, but it does occasionally apply to detective work. Gregson and Lestrade had watched their amateur colleagues' movements with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They failed to perceive what I was beginning to suspect, that every action in question of Holmes's was directed toward a definite, practical end, already clear in his mind. "What is your opinion, sir?" both detectives asked in one breath. "I should be robbing you the credit for unraveling this case if I were so bold as to imagine I could assist you," Holmes replied. "You are managing the matter so well that it would be a pity for a third party to interpose." I caught a distinct note of dry, biting irony in his words. "However," he continued, "if you will be so good as to keep me informed of your progress, I shall be happy to afford you any help in my power. In the meantime, I should like to speak with the constable who first discovered the body. Do you have his name and address?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. "John Rance," he said. "His beat is over now. You will find him at 46, Audley Court, Kennington Parkgate." Holmes jotted down the address. "Come, Doctor," he said, "let's go and look up this man." Then, turning back to Gregson and Lestrade, he added, "I will give you a few points which may be of use to you. This is murder, and the murderer was a man. He is more than 6 feet high, was in the prime of life, has small feet for his stature, wore coarse, square-toe boots, and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He came here with his victim in a 4-wheeled cab, which was drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on the off foreleg. In all probability, the murderer has a florid complexion, and the fingernails of his right hand are remarkably long. These are only a few leads, but they may assist you." The two detectives exchanged looks of incredulous amusement. "And the cause of death?" Lestrade asked. "Poison," Holmes replied curtly. Turning to leave, on the threshold he paused and added, "One more thing, Lestrade. Rake is a German word for revenge, so don't lose your time looking for Miss Rachel." And with this parting shot, a true Parthian arrow, he walked out of the room, leaving the two rivals standing with their mouths agape, staring after him in mute amazement. Chapter 4. What John Rance Had to Tell. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when we left number 3, Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led the way to the nearest telegraph office, where he dispatched a long telegram. Then, hailing a hansom, he directed the driver to the address Lestrade had given us. "The evidence gathered on the spot is worth next to nothing," Sherlock remarked. "Based on the facts, I have already formed a definitive conclusion and drawn my own results from the case. Still, it is only right that we avoid overlooking even the smallest detail." "You are an extraordinary man, Holmes," I said. "Do you truly expect me to believe that everything you told him is actually the truth, and that you are convinced of it yourself?" "I have not the slightest doubt, nor am I mistaken," he replied. "The first thing I noticed upon arriving at the scene was a double set of carriage ruts leading up to the pathway. The vehicle had evidently pulled up against the garden railings. The ruts were deep and distinct because of the rain last night, and since we have had a long spell of dry weather before that, I concluded these tracks were made during the night of the murder. I also observed clear imprints of a horse's shoes. One of these was far sharper and deeper than the other 3, for which I inferred that one of the 4 shoes was new. Now, mark this. I saw that a carriage had stopped at the house during the rain last night, but it was not the carriage of either Gregson or Lestrade. You heard me ask them about that. Therefore, I conclude that the carriage which drew up at number 3 last night brought the murderer and his victim. That seems logical enough, I admitted. But how on earth could you measure the murderer's height? In this way. In 9 cases out of 10, A man's height can be gauged by the length of his stride. It is a matter of mathematical calculation, though I will not weary you with the figures. Suffice it to say that I measured the murderer's stride twice, once on the clay soil of the garden path, and again in the dust upon the floor. I also had a second means of checking my calculation. When a man writes upon a wall, his instinct is to do so at his own eye level. Now, the writing we saw was exactly 5 feet 11 inches from the floor. You see, it is child's play, not a serious problem at all. And what of his age? I asked. If a man can take a leap of 4 feet or more, it is a fair inference that he is neither old nor infirm. That was precisely the width of the puddle. He sprang across to enter the garden. I saw the tracks of patent leather shoes which had gone around the water, while the man in the coarse, square-toed boots had cleared it with ease. Truly, there is no mystery here. I am simply applying the same deductive methods I described in my article to common facts. Is there anything else that puzzles you? Yes, I replied, the length of the fingernails and the trichinopoly cigars. The writing on the wall was done with a forefinger dipped in blood. My magnifying glass showed me that the plaster had been slightly scratched by the nail. This would not have happened had the stranger's nails been short. As for the cigars, I gathered a pinch of ash from the floor. It was dark and flaky, such as is only produced by a trichinopoly. You should know that I have made a special study of cigar ashes, and have even written a small monograph on the subject. I flatter myself that I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand of cigar or tobacco. It is in such trifles as these that the competent detective differs from the Gregsons and Lestrades. You also suggested that the murderer had a very florid face. I remarked, that was a somewhat daring deduction, though I have no doubt it is correct. But do not ask me about that point just yet. I passed my hand over my forehead. My head is in a whirl. I said, the more I think of it, the more mysterious and impenetrable it seems. How did two men, if there were indeed two, gain entrance to an empty house? What became of the driver who brought them? How could one man force another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What was the motive, since robbery was not intended? How did a woman's ring get there? And why should the murderer, instead of fleeing, stop to scrawl the word rake upon the wall? I confess, I find it impossible to reconcile all these facts. My companion nodded approvingly. You enunciate the difficulties of the case with remarkable clearness and precision, he said. It is true that many of the smaller points remain obscure, though I have settled the main issue in my own mind. As for poor Lestrade's discovery, it was a simple blind to throw the police off the scent by suggesting that a German secret society was involved. But the word rake was not written by a German. You may have noticed that it was formed in the German character, while a real German always uses a Latin A. From this, we may safely conclude that the inscription was not made by a German, but by a bungler who overshot the mark in his anxiety to conceal his tracks. It is, I repeat, a mere ruse to divert the investigation. I shall not explain it more fully to you. Doctor, you know that a conjurer loses his credit once he reveals his tricks. If I show you too much of my method, you will come to the conclusion that I am a very ordinary individual after all. I shall never think that. I exclaimed warmly. You have brought the craft of detection as near to being an exact science as is possible in this world. My words, and even more the sincere tone in which they were uttered, caused my companion to flush with pleasure. I had noticed before that he was as sensitive to flattery concerning his art as a beautiful woman is to praise of her looks. I will tell you one other thing, he continued. The man in the patent leathers and the man in the square-toed boots came together in the same cab. While they walked up the path, they were apparently on the best of terms, possibly even arm in arm. Once in the room, they walked about, or rather, the man in the patent leathers stood still while the other strode up and down. I read all that in the dust. More than that, I could see that as the second man paced, he became more and more agitated. I could tell this by the increasing length of his strides. He was talking as he went, and his passion was evidently rising until it reached a climax. That was when the tragedy occurred. Now, I have told you all I know myself. For the rest is mere surmise and conjecture. We have a good working basis. However, to build upon, we must hurry, for I should like to go to Halley's concert to hear Norman Neruda this afternoon. As we spoke, our hansom had been rattling through a succession of dingy streets and crooked lanes. In one of the most dismal of these, the driver pulled up. "This is Audley Court," he said, pointing with his whip to a narrow brick-lined opening. "I'll wait for you here." Audley Court was not an inviting place. Passing to the narrow entry, we found ourselves in a large, paved courtyard surrounded by a square of gloomy dwellings. We picked our way through groups of unwashed children and lines of discolored linen hanging to dry. At number 46, a small brass slide on the door bore the name Rance. Upon inquiring, we were told that the constable was in bed, but we were invited into a small parlor to wait. Presently, the man himself appeared, looking somewhat irritable at having his slumbers disturbed. "I've already made my report at the office," he said gruffly. Holmes took a gold sovereign from his pocket and began to play with it carelessly. "I should be very happy to tell you anything I know," the policeman replied, his eyes following the glitter of the gold. "Then tell us exactly what happened." Rance sat down on the horsehair sofa and, knitting his brows as if determined to omit nothing, began his tale. "I'll tell it to you from the beginning. My watch is from 10 at night until 7 in the morning. At 11, there was a bit of a row at the White Hart, but otherwise everything was quiet on the beat. At 1 o'clock, it began to rain. I met Harry Murcher. He's a man on the Holland Grove beat, and we stood talking for 5 minutes or so at the corner of Henrietta Street. Then it came into my head that I'd better take a look at the Brixton Road to see if all was right. It was about 2 in the morning or thereabouts. The Brixton Road is a lonesome muck heap of a place. Not a soul did I meet, though a cab or two went past me. I was trudging along, thinking how nice a drop of something hot would be, when suddenly I saw a light in the window of number 3. Now, I knew those 2 houses in Lauriston Gardens were empty on account of the landlord won't do the drains. The last tenant there died of typhoid fever. I stopped, dead astonished, and looking at the light in the window, I knew at once there was something wrong. I went up to the door. "And you stopped. Then you went back to the railings." My friend interrupted. "Why did you do that?" Rance jumped, staring at Sherlock Holmes with pure amazement. "That's exactly how it was, sir," he cried. "Only the devil himself could have told you that. The truth is, when I looked at that grim, silent house, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be better to have a mate with me? Now, I'm not a man who's easily scared, and I'm not afraid of anything in the usual way. What could they do to me? But I couldn't help thinking, what if it was that poor fellow who died of typhoid come back to his old rooms to look at those cursed pipes?" The thought gave me such a turn that I felt a cold shiver run right down my spine, and I went back to the gate hoping to see the glimmer of Murcher's lantern. But the street was deserted. Not a soul in sight. Not a living creature. Sir, not even a dog. So I pulled myself together, went back to the door, opened it, and stepped inside. Everything was deathly quiet. Then I went into the room where the light was coming from. There was a red wax candle burning on the mantelpiece, and by its light I saw. Yes, I know what you saw. You walked around the room several times. Then you knelt by the body. Then you walked across and tried the kitchen door. Then John Rance sprang to his feet. His face was a mask of terror and suspicion. "Where were you hide and seek all that?" he demanded. "You seem to know as much as I do." Holmes burst into a fit of laughter and tossed his business card onto the table. "Don't think of arresting me on suspicion," he said. "I am one of the hounds, not the wolf. Mr. Gregson and Mr. Lestrade can confirm that. But please continue. What did you do next?" Rance sat down again, though his expression remained uneasy. "I went out and blew my whistle. That brought Murcher and 2 other constables. Was the street still empty then?" Holmes inquired. "Well, nearly empty. What do you mean by that?" The policeman made a face. I've seen plenty of drunks in my time, but never in all my born days have I seen a man as far gone as a stranger standing there when I came out. He was clutching the garden railings with both hands, howling songs at the top of his lungs. I think he was singing about Columbine or some such nonsense. He was no use to us, as he could barely keep his feet. What did he look like? Holmes asked. John Rance seemed annoyed by the persistence with which my friend questioned him on such seemingly irrelevant matters. He was a man who was disgustingly drunk, first of all, and it's a certainty he'd have woken up in a cell this morning if we hadn't been occupied with much more serious business. His face? His clothes? Did you notice nothing? Holmes cried impatiently. I should think I saw him well enough, seeing as I had to prop him up for a bit. Murcher and I together, one on each side. He was a tall fellow, red-faced, and that will do, Holmes interrupted. And what became of him? We had enough on our hands without him, the policeman grumbled. But I'd lay a wager he found his own way home eventually. What was he wearing? A brown overcoat. And did he have a whip in his hand? A whip? No, he did not. He must have left it in the cab, my friend muttered. Did you not hear the sound of wheels driving away shortly after? No, I heard nothing. Here, take this, Holmes said, dropping a sovereign into the man's palm. He picked up his hat and stood. I fear, Rance, that you will never rise to great heights in your profession. A head should not be viewed as a mere appendage of body, but as a useful machine. You could have earned your sergeant's stripes last night. The man you held in your hands was the very man who holds the key to this mystery. In short, he is the man we are hunting. Do not argue. It is useless. I tell you it is so. Come, doctor. We walked out, leaving the constable in a state of utter bewilderment. The quadruple idiot. Holmes burst out bitterly as we drove toward our lodgings. To think that he had such a golden prize in his hands and let it slip through his fingers. I still don't quite see it all clearly, I said. It's true the description of the man matches the one you gave us as the second actor in the drama. But why would he return to the scene of the crime? Criminals don't usually do that. As far as I know, the ring, my friend, the ring, that is why he returned. If we have no other way of catching him, we still have the ring to use as a lure. But I shall find a way, doctor. I'll bet any sum I shall find him, and I shall owe it to you. For had it not been for you, I might not have stirred from my chair and would have missed the chance to make these most interesting observations. I would have missed a study in scarlet, as the artist might call it. What a fine color that thread truly is. The scarlet thread of murder running through the colorless skein of life. Our task is to trace it, to unravel it, and to expose every inch of it. But for now, let's have some lunch, and then I am off to hear Norma Neruda. Her fingering and her bowing are truly remarkable. How does that little piece by Chopin go that she plays so beautifully? Tra-la-la-lira-lira. Leaning back in the cab, the amateur detective began to sing like a bird, while I was left to marvel at the extraordinary complexities of the human mind.